So good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here and taking the time out to look at a subject that in normal times is probably pretty dry and not a lot of people pay attention to over the years. The MDP and the Land Use Bylaw goes way back to when the Planning Act of 1977 was passed. It required municipalities throughout Alberta to start looking to the future and trying to guide future development and control that development by through the Land Use Bylaw and guide it through the Municipal Development Plan, or the MDP. So Drum did that, and its first one was passed and then modified in 1988. I think Darrell alluded to how they've changed probably in about a decade-long cadence. 1998's version was just kind of mashing together the then City of Drumheller and the then MD of Badlands into one document. There wasn't a lot of bold moves made because it was a little bit to satisfy the amalgamation, which was done by a plebiscite between the city and the Badlands. It was changed again in about 2008. Again, not a lot of change was put into that document. Things were rolling along not bad. And then here we are now, a dozen years later, to look at the MDP. So those previous MDPs and land use bylaws were very much in vogue with the culture of the day. And that was to look at the private land and how do we control the development on that private land so it doesn't get out of control. And the thought and spirit of everything in Alberta was control growth and be in front of it and make those dang developers pay attention. So that's kind of how the land use bylaws went. And whether it was Palliser or particular consultants, they might have just borrowed stuff from other communities, and Drumheller might have said, hey, that's a good thing that that's what's going on, because that's what Three Hills has, or that's what Olds has, or that's what Calgary has. When we embarked on the flood mitigation program, and were finally successful, only in July 1st of this year, by the way, of getting the final deal inked or signed by the federal government, we said, there's got to be more to the MDP if we're truly going to say, let's quit building in the river. We have to stop building in the river. And in order to do that, we need to make opportunities outside of the river. So first thing became, well, where is the river? So we looked at the maps, and in that Alberta Environment and Canada published maps that cover a lot of the valley. And they were pink and red, showing flood fringe and floodway for a long time. There's a new version out that's got a lot of blue on it. But they're based on a study done by Matrix Solutions back in 2007. And a lot of people have said, Darwin, that covers like 2/3 of the developable area. 2/3 of the homes in the valley are covered by these pink maps saying that they're all in the floodplain. And I say, no, I don't think so. I think it's about 80%. Okay? There's a lot of territory that's in the floodplain. And there's a lot of good reason for that back in our history of going from tents to shacks to mobile homes to stick-built throughout these areas that were around the mines. There was a lot of development that took place. So we know that over time, if we can present opportunities for people to build outside of the floodplain, then it's going to be to their benefit and the benefit of the public at large. So with that, we're devising a plan, a municipal development plan, that enables development, makes it easier for developers to undertake projects in Drumheller, and allows opportunity for people if they choose to move out of the river. So the rivers in Drum are the Rosebud and the Red Deer. And then we got two significant creeks, the Machichi Creek and the Willow Creek. And while the Willow doesn't have a lot of development along it, it could. And if we're going to look at a strategy that takes us 100 years out, 80 years out to the year 2100, it's important that we're looking at the whole valley and what opportunities might present themselves there. So with that, we've basically broken the community, the land fabric. Instead of just looking at the private land and what we can do to get in people's kitchens to control what happens on that land, we've taken a holistic view and said, what about the entire valley? What about the public land and the private land, and how do they interface, and how do we figure out what's happening going forward? So to do that, we said we've got to look at our rivers. We've got to look at our creeks first and see how they behave, and from that we can then start to predict how that might impact the particular developments that are on the private lands. So the river's number one, and that was the first thing that we said would be a cornerstone or first principle of the Municipal Development Plan. Second thing we said is what makes it so unique and enjoyable for people that are in the valley and people that visit the valley. And we said that that's the Badlands. And with that, we've identified that the Badlands are a number 2 pillar in what we have. And then we said, all right, what else is unique, and what should be a first pillar in how we look at development going forward? And the next one is the neighborhoods. And through that, we recognize that they're unique, and those neighborhoods are a big part of the fabric of Drumheller. They're a big part of what we are and how we are, and that's a big fundamental to our program. And then finally we say, okay, where's development opportunities to get out of the river? So we've taken a guess and we've said, okay, maybe this piece of land, maybe this piece of land. I think next Wednesday I meet with those landowners to talk about what those opportunities are. But when we bundle those 4 things together, we then said, all right, what's next steps in the plan? And how do we write the land use bylaw in such a way that it supports those 4 elements? The land use bylaw presently has 21 different divisions. It's got residential, duplex, R2, it's got R3 for apartment buildings, R4, urban transitional, agriculture, on and on and on. Just a big long menu, just like everybody else. And we said, that's not sustainable, that's not helpful to developers. When I left the valley and worked with a large engineering company, a big part of what we did was develop thousands of lots throughout Alberta. And I'd always try to entice the developers to come to Drum and say, come on, let's go have a look at Drumheller. It's really cool, it's really neat, similar to the Okanagan, the Osoyoos areas, Southwest US. Let's go have a look at what we could maybe do there. And they'd say, no, it's too confusing. There's too much ambiguity. There's too much rules. Let's just stay on Highway 2. Let's just stay in Northern Alberta. Let's just stay in the Okanagan and make our money there. So they wouldn't show up. So that was part of the influence on this, based on council's direction, that they want to enable development, they want to make it friendly, they want to make it enjoyable and easy to do business in Drumheller. So that's what became our 4th pillar, is that opportunity to develop and make it easier. And one of the things we did was took those 21 land use districts down to 8. And that's very, very important as to what we think the development industry needs to establish some certainty and be able to move ahead. When we get to the actual protection measures, the absolute fundamental of the flood mitigation program is to protect the health and well-being of the citizens, but also to preserve the value of the properties. We know that the insurance companies and the banking industry and the government of Canada and Alberta are looking at all flood communities and saying, there's got to be a better way. This is costing too much money every time these floods happen in the same place, and they're very predictable. So, Drumheller, here's an envelope of cash. It's how much you asked for. Please try and fix your problem. Well, what we need to do is we need to establish a protection system for about 1,300 homes in the valley that is robust enough that we can go back to the insurance companies and say, this is protected, and it's well protected, and the risk is very low. So please keep insuring these properties. Why that's so important is we're not talking about flood insurance here. talking about insurance, general casualty insurance for properties, that they're starting to look at and say, no, we better get out of this game. There's too much risk, even if it is floods that they might not be fully liable for. There's still exposure to the insurance companies. So with that, if we can create a protection system that establishes a robust enough system that we can go back to those insurance companies and say, no, Drum's got a good system, please keep insuring it. People can still get that checkbox on their mortgage applications that they have insurance, and then they'll get a mortgage. Without that, you won't get a mortgage, and we'll see the whole town wither. And that's scary. And that's based on what the various banks and insurance groups are telling us. That's not far off. That's probably within about a 5-year term. So we're hitting it just right, and we're hitting it hard to be able to establish that protection zone in the valley. So we've got 8 steps to try and get there, and those 8 steps are how we're going to change the channel. First off, our design basis is that we're going to build the dikes to about 1,800 cubic meters per second of capacity. We're going to make the tops 6 meters wide so that it's safe to rapidly haul earth on to adapt that dike to even a higher flow, but it also provides a base that we can build higher on. If we just go on the tiny dikes that we have from 05, we experienced we had to make huge sides to them and make them very tall to try and get ready for the 3,000 CMS that was originally predicted. And yeah, that's a big undertaking. If we build them to the ultimate guess of what a flow might be, we're looking at some very, very large diking that would have to be constructed, and then it's there all the time, which could really have a negative effect on the property values throughout the valley for a one-time event that may not happen. So we've chosen to use this approach, as we call it in the industry, an adaptive approach, where we can, based on the time from the Dixon Dam to here, we can readily predict what the flow is going to be and the timing of that flow's arrival, and as such be able to adapt the height of our dikes to fit that. Our next step is knowing our flow. If I say to this group, we have a flood coming at us from the Dixon Dam that is equal to the 1% exceedance of the flow in the Red Deer River based on the natural flow model that's been prepared. Can anybody tell me how many cubic meters per second that is and how high the river will be? Probably not, okay? We want to get beyond that gobbledygook and go right to what's going to be on the radio and what's going to be on the Alberta Rivers app or the Dixon Dam website, and it's going to say 1,800 cubic meters per second is the 1 in 100 regulated flow that's coming, or 3,000 CMS. And to do that, we're going to put signs all about the community with established levels on them that you can relate to a particular flow. So when you hear it on the radio or you see it on an app, you can then readily identify with that and say, oh, okay, no problem, this is going to be fine. Or, hey, this could be a problem, we better get ready. And it'll help with all our emergency management and be able to help the citizens help themselves, which is step number 1 in a multi-barrier solution. You got to be able to protect yourself, and you have that responsibility as well. The protected zones. Those areas that we put dikes in front of generally have, and this might sound like an oversimplification, but we put the dikes between the river and the houses. And that drives some people right around the bend going, well, I've never had that, and it never floods, and why are you picking on my property? So, I mentioned earlier, and I think the mayor touched on it, there's probably about 40 homes directly affected because we have to put the dikes between the river and the homes. That moves up the protection system to allow about 1,300 homes in total to be protected up and down the valley. So that's a pretty good rate of return when we can say we're going to affect 40, but we're going to protect 1,300. And those protection zones are going to be those areas between the diking that's right adjacent to the river and an area that's probably at about the 2100 cubic meter per second, which is a pretty reasonable protection level. It's the same as what the 1915 flood was, and that's probably the highest event that we've experienced in the valley in modern times. So that system 2100 is going to help us delineate between the protection zone and the river. So those folks that live in there will be at some risk, but as I said earlier, we're going to demonstrate to the insurers, the banks, and the residents alike that it's protected reasonably, it's protected well, that the town staff are well trained in all the different elements that are going to have to be considered, from sanitary sewer to rainfall events behind the dike while the rivers are high, and make certain that the insurance companies are comfortable to continue to provide the insurance. So that's the protection zones. The new growth areas will be beyond that. They'll be beyond the 2100 system. So back in the day when the mining activity was very active in the valley and it was just starting up, the engineers that were building the rail lines, the highways of the day, and establishing where the mine entrances were, they used a bit of medieval engineering to establish the elevation of those. And then what they did was they looked around and seen where the driftwood was from the 1902 flood, which was very similar to the 1915, and said, hey, we should just build a little higher than that, and that will probably get us out of trouble as it relates to any flooding that may happen in the future. And they were right. So it makes it relatively easy for us to say the old rail embankments and many of the numbered highways, that's the elevation that we have to be at to say there's a low risk beyond that from there to the Badlands for there to be any risk of building. So that's where the new areas are going to be identified and help us quit building in the river. So our river behaves pretty good most of the time. It's very rare that it gets out of control and really becomes a problem for us. What we want to do is look at that zone between the dikes and the river and say, all right, this is the conveyance zone. So this is the river, and this is where we're going to let the river play and do its thing. But it's also going to be an area that we can establish and say, that's the river. And that's where we can have some great experiences on public and private land. So if people want to build a campground there, a golf course, ball diamonds, nature walks, whatever, whether it's private or public land, there's going to be uses that we can have for it. Some areas we're going to say, absolutely, that's a natural area. We need that for the river to expand and contract or breathe. And other areas we're going to say, you know what, if there's something reasonable on there like a campground that the water will just flow over and move through, that's not a big impediment, and that's probably a good use of the conveyance zone. We're investing a lot of public money, and whether it comes from the federal government, the provincial government, or the municipal government, it's all public money. And whether it's a road that we're going to use as a berm, i.e. the highways, whether it's the old rail embankments that we're going to use to be diking, or it's a purpose-built dike that we're going to use to be a trail system, it's public money, public right-of-way. People have to be able to use that. But it also helps us make certain, as much as possible, that we've established those areas as diking and that conveyance zone doesn't get impinged on or built in. Post-1915 flood, the then town, I guess it was, decided that they should build a flood wall. And that flood wall would be the demarcation point that says don't build between the river and there. And that goes from about the rectory at St. Anthony's Church over by the Central School on, I guess, 3rd Street West, and comes all the way around to 5th Street East and 2nd Ave, Shoemaker's Corner. And if you walk some of the back alleys and just pay attention now that we've mentioned it, you're going to see a whole bunch of modern retaining walls, and you're going to see some of those old stone walls, and you're going to see some bricks and mortar retaining walls that were built around homes that were established there in the late 50s, early 60s. And the whole idea was don't build between there and the river until they started. And they built a rodeo grounds, and then they built an outdoor skating rink, and then they added artificial ice to the skating rink, and then they covered the skating rink, and then there was tennis courts, and then there was a police building, and then a clinic. Anyways, you see where we are right now. So we're in the river, as the 1915 flood would describe. So we've got to look at those areas and say, we're going to make a new demarcation line, and that's going to be the old abandoned rail lines through the valley. It's going to be the highway systems that are numbered highways, and we're going to make trail systems on there that we're hopeful to the year 2100 will be protection to 2100 cubic meters per second. And also another area that if we need a second line of defense and things really change in the future climate, then we've got an area that everybody knows where the safe zone is and where development can occur outside of the valley, but also where we would have to build even higher dikes if we got something like a 3,000 or 4,000 event. So knowing the flow and using that public investment to the public benefit is really important. We've seen various studies, they're more anecdotal than scientific, that describe that we're seeing I think it's 12% increase in some of the property values in places like Airdrie and Canmore, where proximity to trails is immediate for homeowners. So again, by establishing that old rail line and making certain that the developments are adjacent to it, it hopefully is going to be attractive to developers in the valley and or external or partnerships or whatever to do developments and have that amenity available, but also be in the dry side of the valley. So that's what we were talking about thus far, is those four zones in the valley, and how do we get building out of the river? We need to build out of the river, and it's fairly straightforward for us to do that. So we have no growth zone, which is the conveyance zone or the river. We have limited growth, which is the protected area that we're going to do we're going to do our absolute best to convince the insurance companies and the banks to keep banking and insuring those buildings that are in that protection zone. But we're also identifying new growth zones, and finally we have the Badlands that'll be a no-go zone with regard to the Land Use Bylaw. So it's very important that we establish that as our first principles, and then based on that we can look at improving the diking system and working with developers to try and attract more. So we've got these in the diagram there, we're kind of showing our pointy top dikes, as I like to refer to them now. They've got anywhere from a 2.5 to a 3.5 meter top on them. We've got to widen that out to be the 6 meters so that we don't have a major safety concern, and we have something to build on if we're going to truly make an adaptive system. So we've chosen that 6 meter top. The height of the dikes generally, and you know, it's real dangerous for me to say this, and our comp shop will give me hell at the end of this, but it's going to be about 1.5 meters is roughly what we're going to add to the existing dikes, and that might vary from place to place depending on velocity, etc. But that's about what we need to add to the diking system to get it up to that 1,800. In areas where there aren't dikes, you can probably guess what they are, Knapmine and Rosedale, and those areas are unprotected right now. So there's no way we can even begin to check the box for the insurance companies or the bank for those areas to say that they have some measure of protection. So that's probably where we're going to be starting to make certain that we can preserve the value of the homes that are there. And those areas will vary and might not be as high as the 1.5. That's why we chose to leave them back in the 80s and 90s. Was it wouldn't be tough to add too much, but we need to make an overall protection system to preserve the value through insurance and others. So the new MDP is placing the river at the heart of things. It protects the Badlands, makes opportunities for growth in the future, and enhances the valley's unique neighborhoods rather than communities. We recognize that they're different. So whether you're in the Wayne Valley or whether you're in East Cooley or Midland, Bankview or Green Tree, you're in different neighborhoods in Drum, and you have different needs with regard to flood mitigation. But we do know that the entire community is impacted if we have to evacuate the hospital, if we have to evacuate zones of some neighborhoods. It impacts the manpower and staffing that are available at the pen. It affects what we have to do at the hospital. When we go on lockdown at the pen, that then changes the availability of people. So whether you live in Bankview or Green Tree, you're probably out helping your neighbors move stuff to higher ground, or you're helping with sandbags or whatever. So it becomes a whole community event when we have these high water situations, and it affects everyone. So we want to try and diminish that impact by making a higher level of protection based on what the federal and provincial government are coming up with for new flows. So those new flows are probably going to be published by the province and Canada at the end of November, or it might be into the new year, depending on how their projects and the government wants things rolled out. So we should see those numbers, and once we see those numbers, we can then start to finalize our designs. We're taking some guesses right now to try and figure out what might be the final design heights and those flows, but I can't finalize it, and I can't say this is absolutely it until I get those numbers from the province, and then we do some detailed design. So everybody would like to just pass by all this gobbledygook and say, Darwin, tell me what's exactly going to happen in my backyard. Here's what I know. I don't know. Okay? Until I get that information from the province, we've got to be able to speak clearly and with a good, strong voice to people that this is what's going to happen, rather than a bunch of conjecture or guessing. So it's really important that we get that information from the province soon. The new land use bylaw covers everything from the Badlands that just isn't going to have activity, that's why it's kind of shaded out or faded, through to employment. That's kind of bright and brilliant red there to identify just how much effort we have to put in and the benefit that we're going to get out of those particular areas. So that's where we're in 8 areas rather than the traditional R1, R1A, R3, urban transitional, agriculture, etc. We've broken it down into this, which is very novel in Alberta, probably Western Canada, but we are hearing from a lot of flood communities in Alberta in particular and nationally that, hey, can we have a look at what you guys are doing there? And it's being very well received. We're going to develop and are developing various scenarios. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can find them on the website, work through the panels at the back. But not unlike a FAQ, we're trying to establish, hey, what are some of the things that may or may not be happening? So the protected zones I've described, parking minimums. In these bylaws, parking, for example, kind of caught on everywhere. You should have lots and lots of parking. Parking's really expensive when you consider that space used up instead of being retail. And whether it's 12 grand a stall or 20 grand a stall for a surface lot, or 50 grand a stall to build a parkade, it's a lot of money that's got to be invested that isn't a retail store, isn't being taxed, isn't really producing a lot to the local economy. So those parking stalls, if we have too many, then maybe we've got to look at another opportunity and say, let's use up all the parking, and once we've used it all up, then let's try and solve the problem, rather than saying, yeah, we must have a parking problem because everyone else does, so let's make rules that say if you're opening an ice cream stand, you need a bunch of parking, when there's 3 or 4 parking stalls right in front of you, or 4 behind you within half a block. So the new bylaw says parking is not a mandatory requirement. If you're a shopping center, you're probably through market-driven activity going to put lots of parking in front of your building, but that's going to be a choice, just like the facade of your building, versus mandated by the municipality. We're going to grandfather in houses, so in a lot of cases it'll be called just grandfathered in. You won't be out of sync with the bylaw until you do something major on the property. Then we're going to have to be in a position where you might have to lift it up, you might have to change your side yards, you might have to do some repair. But that's been very common in Drumheller for 40 years, so I don't see that being impediment. So our timeline, we started on this in the spring of 2020. Our consultants told us we were crazy, we'd never be able to get through this at the speed that we did. And here we are in October with a public hearing set at Council for October 26th. And we have a series of community engagement sessions. I think we've got about 14 of them to do over the next little while, and stakeholder groups are part of that 14 number as well. We call them engagement sessions on here. And based on all the inputs received at the public hearing through programs such as this, we then will be able to bundle that up, present it to council for them to consider second and third readings at some future date after the public hearing, and any amendments to the bylaw that we've caught that should be made. So I think Michelle and April passed out, or they were available at the front desk, some comment forms, and they could be positive, they could be negative. Seems the negatives seem to win the day sometime because the silent majority remains silent. But if you like what you see, say that. If there's suggestions that you have, please add that to it as well. And there's a ton of information on drumheller.ca / flood mitigation. And I think the other website is Land Use Drumheller. Go navigate the web, there's tons there. If you need more information, if you want one-on-one, we've got tons of information there. Call us at any time, get a hold of any of your council members, talk to Daryl. Palliser Regional Planning, the guys at the back, they got their work cut out for them. They're going to be running lead of being able to assemble all this information and distribute it and make recommendation to council, because they're going to be living with that planning for a long time to come.